Couple days ago, Gavin Ortlund, an apologist who I really wasn't that familiar with, but I've gotten to know him a little bit in the last couple of days. So he had posted this video providing a defense, an apologetic defense or reading of references to Israelite holy war against allegations or charges of genocide. And he took a very strong and bold thesis. He tried to defend that no non-combatants were targeted or harmed in these battles. And I think that's just honestly, I think that's patently indefensible. I've already had this conversation with Paul Copan, and I had some back and forth with Gavin following the first video I posted in response, and then I made a follow-up video that, to my knowledge, he hasn't replied to. But I will say that I really appreciated him and enjoyed interacting with him. That he seems like a really stand-up, nice person, very much in terms of First Peter 3:15, giving a reason for the hope that lies within, and doing so with gentleness and respect. He definitely has that part. He's a great exemplar of that kind of character of engagement with others. But again, I think that that was unsuccessful. Now he posted another sort of a follow-up video this morning about Deuteronomy 21, a specific passage where he argues, where many critics argue that it can lead to war rape, and he's defending the passage against the allegation. And again, I think he's unsuccessful in his apologetic defense. I actually think, however, that there are also some deeper concerning issues underlying his analysis. So what I want to do, by the way, I have my one of my dogs with me here. Um, what I want to do is review the passage and then offer some real critical response to his analysis or defense. So here's Deuteronomy 21. The passage in question is verses 10 to 14, and I've actually taken a screenshot of the passage as it appears in Gavin's video. He says, when the passage says, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. Okay, so that's the passage. And I now want to discuss Gavin's apologetic defense of it and my critical response. First thing I want to say by way of response is there's a real, I think, an irony here that this video comes right after the previous video. And remember, in the previous video, Gavin was arguing that non-combatants were not killed in the wars that Israel had with other peoples. Israel, the soldiers would only battle against soldiers, not against non-combatants like women and children, infants, the elderly, the handicapped, etc. They would not harm those individuals, just soldiers. However, now we turn to Deuteronomy 21, and what's the first thing we read? When the father and mother have been killed by the Israelite soldiers, the Israelite army, this is what you do to their daughter. This is how you can treat her if you want to marry her. So, right there in black and white on the page, we have a reference to women, to mothers being killed by the Israelite soldiers. It's just one more example of a flat disconfirmation of Gavin's attempt to argue that civilians were not targeted, they were not treated as objects of killing within these battles. They clearly were. And so that is a profound moral problem for an apologist like Gavin who wants to defend the moral status of the text and the claim that God commanded these things, in fact, this kind of killing, or that he in any way approved of it. Okay, but now let's turn to the topic of rape. Obviously, the issue here is that this female, now Gavin often says woman in his video. I'm going to say girl because one thing that's interesting here in Deuteronomy 21, it doesn't refer to a husband having been killed. It refers to a girl's parents having been killed. So that suggests, for the most part, that what Israelite soldiers are most focused on, this would really fit with Numbers 31 as well, by the way. They're really focused on are virgin girls who are not yet married out. In Numbers 31, all of the Midianite women described in the passage, and men and boys are killed, but the virgin girls are spared for the Israelite soldiers. And so here, I think similarly, we can say the primary, and I'm not saying exclusively, there may have been married women who had their husbands killed and were taken by Israelite soldiers. But for the most part, really what we're talking about here are girls. So 15, 16, 17-year-old girls who are not yet married out, not, and by our standards, not legal adults. They're still children, right? Okay, so the one of the issues, I'm going to say, first of all, maybe my broad response to Gavin's video is, which I've linked below in the show notes. My broad response is I think it's a very valuable and helpful discussion, but I think it suffers from overt confirmation bias. So he's trying to have as favorable a reading of Deuteronomy 21 as he can. And as a result, he ends up distorting certain things, bypassing certain issues, downplaying issues and dangers, which I'm going to now highlight. So while I think it's definitely worth watching, I don't think it's worth watching without significant caveats, including at the end of the day, to recognize that, in fact, he does not successfully demonstrate that rape did not occur and was not broadly sanctioned by Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14. Now, one interesting thing, when I watched the video, it was 27 minutes. Gavin doesn't define rape, which I think is interesting. I think that we have to really begin in the top of mind with what does it mean to rape? Well, rape involves sexual contact uh, in which consent has not been given by one party to that sexual contact. Now, next question is, well, what does it mean to give consent? Now, I'm going to speak not as a lawyer here, but I am going to speak, or a law expert, but I'm going to speak as someone who is a full-time workplace investigator who investigates various issues of misconduct, including sexual misconduct in the workplace, and has to have certain definitions in mind and know what they're looking for. So, in order to have something like rape or sexual assault, we have to have a non-consensual sexual interaction of a sexual nature, um, including, of course, ultimately coital activity. Now, the next thing to note is that what does it mean to have consent? Well, you have to have particular elements to have consent. First of all, the person has to be able to consent. So within, for example, Canada, you have to be 16 years old by law. If you're younger than 16, you can't legally consent to sexual activity. Now, it may also be, for example, that a person cannot consent because they lack mental capacity. Maybe they're incapacitated, like they're unconscious. Maybe they've been given, they passed out from too much alcohol, for example. Maybe they are in a counseling relationship and this is their counselor and they cannot consent to sexual activity freely with the counselor because they're in a counseling relationship as a patient. We could go on all sorts of examples like that. But the ability to consent has to be there in the first place. The next thing that has to be there is consent has to be expressed actively and in an ongoing manner. This is so important because we have a very good understanding now that we didn't always in the past of a concept called chronic immobility. Now, when people are in high stress, traumatic situations, what people often will do is used to be called the freeze response. In animals that have a similar response, it's been called playing dead. But people will go into a very passive state. In the most extreme cases, they just may become unconscious and not recall the things that happen. But in other cases, in tonic immobilization, they will just become very compliant with the activity and do what the other person says. But what is and so if you're not in tune to evidence of tonic immobility, then you may be the actor in a sexual encounter with another individual, and you're engaging with them in a way that you believe to be romantic, and they're responding to you by going along with it, quote unquote. But that could be a tonic immobility response of trauma in which they haven't actually given consent. And so what you have to do is you have to look for active and enthusiastic signs that they are in fact consenting, including, yes, I'm happy with this. let's do this, versus wording like, I don't know, I'm unsure, I'm uncomfortable, or just a tonic immobility withdrawal. Now, last thing you also want to look for, another thing anyway, is that the demonstration of active participation and enthusiasm is ongoing and continues to be present throughout the encounter. So these are all things that you want to look for in order for there to be sexual consent. And if there is not, then there could be sexual assault occurring if there is not consent present, or there could be rape. Now that's important when we come to this passage. So here's let's draw the picture now of what is actually being described in Deuteronomy 21. Girl, 15, 16, 17 years old, has just witnessed her parents being killed by Israelite soldiers, and potentially her brothers and siblings as well, like we have in Numbers 31. Ask yourself a question. What would be the response, or psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, for a 15, 16, 17-year-old girl to just have witnessed her beloved parents being killed in front of her, and maybe, her two older brothers as well? Her whole family's been wiped out, they've been massacred. What would be her response to that? I mean, I cannot begin to imagine the degree of trauma, of horror that she would be experiencing in that case. Now you have an Israelite soldier, perhaps one of the very soldiers who killed her family, says to her, "You're attractive. I want to marry you." Now ask yourself this: in that circumstance, can the first principle of consent ever be present? Can a person who has been so traumatized that they've just witnessed their entire family being massacred by this soldier, can they freely consent to have a marital and sexual relationship with this individual? I think that that's an extraordinary claim. And it's one that I would say very strongly is manifestly false. Uh, so I just don't think that you can even talk about having consent for a child that has just had her family massacred, that she can consent to sexual activity in marriage with the soldier that killed her family. Now, Gavin, one of the things he points out is he says, well, in much of the ancient world, when a female family was massacred like this, she was given 7 days to mourn. But in this passage, in Deuteronomy 21, she's given 30 days to mourn, and that's better. I mean, all things being equal, it's less bad. Well, it doesn't mean it's good. I think about this. Which is worse, to be sexually assaulted when you're in a deep sleep, or to be sexually assaulted when you're awake at gunpoint? Well, I mean, it's worse, I would think, all things being equal, to be sexually assaulted when you're awake at gunpoint. It doesn't mean that sexually assaulting someone when they're asleep is somehow some benevolent concession. And so, similarly, you have a 16-year-old girl who's just witnessed her family massacred. She's given 30 days to mourn her family before she has to marry the man who potentially murdered her family. Given 30 days instead of 7, and we're supposed to be enthusiastic about that. I'm I'm going to say no. Now, another thing that really concerns me, and this is where we get into some of the more practical implications of this, is, while again, I don't, Gavin doesn't define rape so far as I can see in the concept of consent. But what he does here is there's a focus upon rape as a sort of violent assault by like a stranger. And what I think Gavin really needs to consider more deeply is the degree to which rape can occur and does occur within marriages. Now, this has been a long problem within evangelical community. This lack of or failure to understand the degree to which rape can occur in all sorts of contexts. I want to give you an extreme, potentially an extreme example here, but I think actually it is indicative of some tragically still common elements within evangelical Christianity. Okay, the transformed wife is a well-known blogger and tweeter, or X poster or whatever it is today. And this was one of her most infamous tweets, I think, from a few years ago. I think this was back in like 2019. She actually, there was a controversy over it, and she ended up writing a blog article saying that she doesn't support rape in any way. But this was the beginning of a question. So a woman's husband wanted sex with her, but she said no. She woke up in the middle of the night and he was having sex with her. She asked me if this was marital rape. It was the first time he had done this, and he was never physically abusive toward her. I told her, no, don't even think like that. And then she goes on. So this again, this is extreme, yes. But I think the what is expressed here are some underlying sentiments that are really have an inadequate appreciation for how important consent is at all times and in all relationships, including in marriage. If we don't appreciate that, there's a real danger, right? That we could be encouraging people to remain in abusive relationships, which are relationships in which people are being sexually assaulted because they're not giving consent to sexual activity. Just because you're married doesn't mean that your spouse has rights over your body. It just doesn't work like that. And so in this case, my concern is that when Gavin in his apologetic focuses on the fact that while they were married, then somehow that is going to allow for consent, I think is just a really dangerous idea. Because again, I think the idea that a 16, 17-year-old who witnessed her family massacred and then does marry this fellow, that she is somehow now going to be a willing participant and be able to consent as an agent to sexual contact with this individual in marriage is just profoundly flawed thinking. And I really worry, I think it's a reasonable concern that assumptions in an apologetic of Deuteronomy 21 could then corrupt the way that people think about sexual assault in the church today and in other contexts in our own day. So that is a concern for me. Another thing that Gavin says in this video is he addresses the fact, well, the critics will say, well, how can she consent to marrying this soldier? It's but then Gavin says, yeah, but it's an arranged marriage, and arranged marriages happen all the time, including today. Well, that is true. Arranged marriages do happen, including today. In fact, just a month ago or so, I met two Christians from India one of them was from India and the other was Indian, hopefully, but was believed born in Canada. And they married 30 years ago, maybe, and they've been happily married, but it was from an arranged marriage. So yeah, arranged marriages happen. But Deuteronomy 21 is not describing an arranged marriage. Arranged marriages are arranged between two families. Those families begin to dialogue with one another, and there's an exchange, various social and perhaps economic arrangements are made, and then one person is married to another person, and those families are united. And of course, within much of royal history, this has occurred at the level of nation states, where Scotland, for example, would marry off a daughter to a king of France, and then that would establish a social relationship and an economic and a military relationship between Scotland and France. So there was a mutuality about the arrangement. But in Deuteronomy 21, what we have is the soldiers have come in, massacred the family, killed the mother and father, and then they're just taking the daughter. That's not an arranged marriage. So it's what that is a red herring. It's just and a non sequitur. It just does not apply to this circumstance. Okay, I could say more about this, but I'm just going to say I don't think that Gavin really addresses the degree to which Deuteronomy 21 does set up the conditions for women and girls being raped by the soldiers who marry them. This is granting, by the way, a lot of the things that he does say in the video, which I don't disagree with. So there's a lot of value in the video, a lot of things I wouldn't contest, but I think some of the most central issues are remain unaddressed in his video.